If you are new to the reptile hobby, it can be very, very daunting. As you dig your way through the internet, you're going to find a large diversity of ways reptiles are kept. Some keepers are using sterile tubs, others are using large enclosures with fake plants and climbing branches, and others are taking another step and doing bioactive with live plants and soils and insects and whatnot. But which one of those is correct? Well, in reality, to determine if a keeper is on the right track, we must analyze their mindset and not their setup. Any one of the options I mentioned earlier could in fact be correct. Now, how could a sterile tub and a bioactive enclosure both be correct? Well, let me explain. I can summarize the correct way to keep reptiles with one word: progression. This is why both keeping in a sterile tub and in a bioactive enclosure can technically both be correct. If a keeper has a mindset that is directed towards bettering the care of their animal, then they can be very confident that they are on the correct path. In other words, the only difference between a tub keeper and a bioactive keeper should be time and experience in the hobby. And of course, I know that's not always true because tubs can be used for quarantine and hospital tanks, and there's also many people in the hobby who aren't interested in participating in that progressive mindset and they're happy to stay in that tub zone. But I believe as a rule of thumb, the only difference between a tub keeper and a bioactive keeper should be time and experience. As Liam already stated in the previous video, you want to use the animal's welfare as your compass. As you move your care closer and closer towards what they will experience in nature, your animal's welfare will increase. You do not need to start with a zoo-level habitat. If you are a new keeper, then A, you probably aren't interested in spending $1,000 on a new setup, and B, you probably aren't experienced or seasoned enough to be able to manage a more complicated setup. I would much rather somebody start with a simple setup that's clean and easy to care for. You can understand your animal and learn how they tick, and then as you grow, you can slowly increase your level of care. I would rather that than somebody that wants to go out and spend $1,000 and start with something that's really, really overly complicated, and then the animal will get sick or they'll lose their animal because there's just too much moving parts and they don't have the experience in order to care for a bioactive enclosure properly. So here's a personal story of exactly what I'm talking about. And we're going to talk about this enclosure right here, which is my jungle carpet python enclosure. So I'm going to tick through some video here that I've filmed in the past. So these first clips here are of when I first brought my carpet python home. This is his quarantine setup. Very, very basic, paper substrate, one climbing branch, a hide, and a water dish, and that is it. Now I believe he spent about 6 months in this enclosure, and about the 2-month mark, I did add some natural substrates, but other than that, it pretty much stayed the same, and this was a perfect time for me to get acquainted with this animal. So again, after 5 or 6 months, I was ready to do the next step of progression towards better care. So then he was then upgraded to the enclosure that he's in now. I added a bunch of climbing branches and cork hollows and fake plants. And even though he was a small snake, I was very, very confident that I would have success with him in this large enclosure because I spent the 6 months getting to know him as an animal. As soon as I added him into this large enclosure, I start seeing new behaviors that I didn't see in the tub, which was absolutely fantastic. And again, had I started with this large enclosure, I probably would have had a horrible time getting this animal to feed. He was a very small snake when I got him. He came from a rack system from the breeder, and if I had thrown him right from the breeder rack system into this large enclosure, he would have suffered, and so would I. I'm guarantee I would have had a much harder time getting him to eat. So this is why those steps of progression towards natural setups is important. So after adding him into the large enclosure, he spent about 8 or 9 months in that enclosure without any changes. Now, a big part of that is because I don't want to run out and spend a whole bunch of money at once. I as a person, need to slowly add money to the hobby. I can't just run out and go spend a bunch of money and then I'm going to suffer financially. So I slowly want to be improving my care when I can afford it. Now, the next step for this enclosure was adding proper lighting. So I added a screen to the top and added UV lighting, visible light, as well as a halogen bulb to better simulate the sun. Again, another step towards nature. And then finally, a few weeks after I added the nice lights, I had to add some live plants to really finish it off, and that's where the state it is in now. He has live plants, a bunch of different live plants, as well as some really nice light. So this is, again, the steps that I'm taking from that tub quarantine setup, which is really plain, towards something that's much more naturalistic and nice to look at and far more enriching for the snake. I couldn't have done this in one fell swoop. It would have cost me too much money and the snake probably would have suffered. He would have been too scared and probably would have gone off food. The slow progression towards nature is all that is necessary. Progression does not need to be immediate. Allow yourself to grow. Increase your standard of care with your goal of replicating nature when you are able to. Of course, this is just the progression of the enclosure. Enrichment for our reptiles extends far more than that.
Snakes and other reptiles under human care no longer having to use 100% of their time and energy budgets simply on survival and reproduction, Providing them with environmentally complex enclosures as well as additional behavioral enrichment opportunities is important in progressing care.